Larissa Powell with Your Home Sold Guaranteed, and I'm here with an amazing guest, is Brian Reeves with Neighborhood Loans. I have clients who are obsessed with the interest rate versus buying something that's not a super low interest rate. And what are the advantages and disadvantages of, I'm not going to buy until that interest rate gets down to the 2.5?
This question and this dichotomy that we have of the obsession over the rate and the pandemonium over rate and affordability and when is it time to buy is kind of it's just weird paradox. And so what most consumers don't realize is they get fixated on a couple of things. First thing they get fixated on is the interest rate. I want it to be the lowest interest rate, Remember when it was in COVID, it was 2.5. Remember when I got a 1.75 interest rate? Let's just wait for those times to come back, and let's just wait for all of that to happen. There's a couple of things that consumers don't really realize to kind of strip away and kind of walk you through that. During COVID, the federal government infused liquidity into the market. And so they were buying mortgage-backed securities because of the pandemic to help everything out. And so the interest rates dropped during that time frame. And so when that happened, if you remember, house prices just shot up dramatically.
They went up crazy. I had people who were bidding $50,000 over the appraisal and paying out of pocket.
Yes. And so that created this huge vacuum for demand, because a lot of consumers that were renting that would not have typically have bought were looking at this like, hey, I could buy a house for the same size square footage that I'm renting for cheaper than my rent. So you had a large sector of renters that typically weren't in that pool of consumers just go in to buy a home. Well, that wasn't a true indication of where the market should have been. What happened was rates were so low. Well, why did the house hyperinflate that high? Well, that's because for every 1% the interest rates come down, a house hyperinflates by 5%. That's just the demand of just basic economics in the housing sector. And so that's why you had that situation where people were offering 100 over asking, is because we were coming off interest rates of 5% down to 1.75, 2%, 2.25. And so what that did is that raised the house prices so high. Now, when you look at those relatively speaking, the interest rates were lower, but if you would have looked at that higher interest rate with that lower sales price, the payments would have relatively been the same.
And that's the point that buyers don't realize, is that you've got a higher priced house and you have a lower priced house. If the higher priced house has a lower interest rate and the lower priced house has a higher interest rate, it pretty much matches. It just they're close, and you've got to really have a good lender that can help you see the difference. If you're looking at a 30-year loan, another thing that buyers don't realize is you're going to pay 3 to 4 times the original cost if you keep that loan for the full 30 years. So this is another thing to be aware of.
Yeah, and so when you look at the COVID situation, the people that fared well in the COVID situation, when you really dialed this in and look at it, it wasn't really the buyers that just made out. It was the sellers that made out. It was the sellers that sold their house for a lot more, that walked away with tons of equity because the house hyperinflated, when the buyer on the other end of that paid more for the house but at a lower interest rate.
And because this was an artificial house raising that's not normally had a whole bunch of infusion of extra buyers, then the housing prices went up, but now they had to come down. They had to settle down into the reality of what is the normal amount of buyers you want to come in and buy houses. And then, of course, there was a housing shortage for a while, so people were like, okay, now go. They may not have gone that fast if we hadn't have had that infusion from the government.
Well, and when you look at it, the better option for a real estate investor or for somebody that's buying a house, and this sounds total contradictory to what most people will say, or you'll hear friends and family say, is that I will say part of the best time to buy a house is when the interest rates are the highest, if you can afford it. The reason is because that house price is suppressed the lowest. And what happens is that when you buy that house at that lowest price, at a later date, what's going to happen is when the interest rates start to come down, that house is going to inflate. Well, now that's money put into your pocket, not the seller's pocket. So that's why it makes more sense. And then you can refinance. You're not stuck to that payment. You can refinance that home and drop that payment while you're gaining the equity.
Exactly.
So as most consumers, we're trained to look at an interest rate. But if you think about this, most commodities and everything that you buy that's tied to an interest rate is actually a depreciating asset. It doesn't have the same cause and effect that real estate does. If you buy a car and let's say the interest rate is 3%, it doesn't matter if it's 2%, 1%, 3%, 5%. It doesn't matter what your note rate is on the car is going to be less the next day after you drive it off the lot.
And it will continue to lose value.
Correct. And the depreciation of these assets that we buy that have interest rates tied to them, there's no direct correlation between that commodity's value and the interest rate. It's all depreciating. So as consumers, we're taught to look at the interest rate because we want the lowest interest rate possible, not realizing the impact it's going to have on you and your budget in terms of payment and how that affects it, right? And so a lot of these consumers or customers would rather continue to wait and rent until interest rates come down when they don't realize that if they got out of the rental into the house where the interest rates were up, they would gain more money at the end of this. And then on the other end, if you look at rental prices based on this graph that you can see here in 89, these house prices and the annual household income, or these rental prices in the annual and the average income, were relatively close to almost the same. And as you start to see this gap through the years, the renters are paying more money than the buyers. That's why when you look at these studies that they've done on these millionaires, these 10,000 millionaires throughout the country, you could see 85% of them all owned and bought their houses down. They started investing in the S&P 500, Vanguard 500, Invesco's, dollar cost averaging, layering their money, getting 5% of 5 essential stocks, and they just average their money that way, and they start leveraging their equity. And that is the roadmap to getting closer to building wealth, building financial security, instead of being in kind of a renter type situation, just, looking at 401ks and IRAs. 401ks and IRAs are really, really great tools for building resources. For building wealth and for also gaining, but you can accelerate that by being able to tap equity from a home and investing your money.
Yeah, the whole point is be the fish that swims upstream. Swim against the current. Do what everybody else isn't doing. That way you can leverage your money. And that's the whole point of getting a house and getting on that wealth acquisition escalator. Leverage your money by saying, all right, I'll buy it. It is a higher interest rate, but the house is going to hold its value and go up. As the interest rate goes down, all these other houses, they're going to buy a year or 2 years later with the lower interest rate. But your house is still holding its value. It's still going to go up. So yes, think outside the box, do things differently, and you too can create wealth for your family. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Larissa. Again, Brian Reed, Branch Manager with Neighborhood Loans. Larissa, how can people reach out to you?
People can reach me by the phone number on the bottom. I'm Larissa Powell. My husband is TJ Andrus, and we work with Your Home Sold Guaranteed Realty.